hearing will come to order. Good morning, and thank you very much for being here at this cyber attribution hearing. This cybersecurity hearing is one in a series that this subcommittee has held on ways that we can protect our nation's crucial cyber infrastructure. Over the last 2 years, we've held hearings on cybersecurity activities at the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the Department of Homeland Security, as well as on the administration's cyberspace policy review. Just 2 weeks ago, we had an important hearing on the smart grid and spent a great deal of time talking about the necessity of developing strong cybersecurity standards for our national energy infrastructure. We're well aware of the critical role that IT networks play in managing much of our day-to-day activity, from online banking to systems that make sure that there is food on our grocery shelves. This growing reliance on networks has made us more vulnerable to cyber attacks and has increased the potential for such attacks to have far-reaching and crippling effects. Now more than ever, we need to be focused on the development of tools and technologies to prevent, detect, and respond to cyber attacks. History shows that one of the best deterrents to an attack is the ability to identify your attacker. Question is whether such deterrence methods still obtain today. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, each with quite expansive offensive capabilities, were held in check by the notion that an attack would result in retaliation. This was achieved because each country would have been able to precisely identify its attacker. This method of deterrence, the ability to attribute an attack to a particular person, party, or system, can be equally vital to defending against cyber attack. While they are not the end-all solution to our cybersecurity challenges, the development of effective and reliable attribution technology should be an essential part of our efforts to secure the nation's cyberspace. Given that the Internet is intended to be open and anonymous, the attribution of cyber attacks can be very, very difficult to achieve and should not be taken lightly. As co-chair of the Global Internet Freedom Caucus in the House, I am personally very concerned about the potential implications to privacy, anonymity, and Internet freedom posed by attribution technologies. As a result, I believe that it is absolutely imperative that we define and implement clear restrictions on how attribution technologies are developed and used to ensure that they are not misused. I look forward to today's discussion on attribution technologies and how they may help deter cyber attacks. I am interested in discussing the proper roles of the federal government and private industry in the development of these technologies and the research and development that is needed to fill capability gaps. I'm sure, and I am particularly eager to discuss ways to ensure that attribution technologies are not used to infringe upon the safety, privacy, or individual liberties of Internet users. I would like to thank the witnesses for appearing before us today, and I look forward to our discussion. And now I recognize Mr. Hall, the chairman of the full committee, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And since you've made an excellent opening statement and covered almost everything, I can be brief. And I'm sitting in for the ranking member, Mr. Smith. And I thank you for calling the hearing on cyber attack attribution technologies. I also want to thank our very distinguished panel. We rely on you to tell us what the facts are, and from that we glean legislation. And don't be disturbed by the empty chairs here, because they'll all receive copies of your testimony, and many have received copies ahead of time. I've scanned through your testimony. I want to thank you for your panel for being here, and ask you to remember that we're not technical experts, so keep it as simple as possible you can. I've read some of your testimony and understood a lot of it. Ranking Smith's going to be here shortly. In the event it takes him longer than expected, I ask unanimous consent that his statement be made a part of the record, Mr. Chairman. Otherwise, I'll yield the remainder of my time to him when he arrives. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hall. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And I also want to recognize the chairman of the full committee who is in attendance. And Chairman Gordon, very good. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our witnesses. Dr. David Wheeler is a research staff member of the Information Technology and Systems Division at the Institute for Defense Analysis. Mr. Robert Knake is International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Ed Giorgio is the president and co-founder of Ponte Technologies. He also has over 30 years of security experience at the National Security Agency, or NSA, and is a leading authority on security and cryptography. And I want to recognize that Mr. Giorgio is also wearing a Distinguished Service Medal awarded by the NSA. And our final witness is Mr. Marc Rotenberg, who is the president of the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or EPIC. And at our prior hearing on grid security, one of your vice presidents provided very, very interesting, elucidating comments. You'll each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony, and your written testimony will be included in the record of this hearing. When you all complete your testimony, we will begin with questions, and each member will have 5 minutes to question the witnesses. Dr. Wheeler, please proceed.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the House Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation, and I guess of the Committee on Science and Technology, I'm delighted to speak with you today. As noted, my name is Dr. David A. Wheeler. I work at the Institute for Defense Analyses, also known as IDA. IDA is, and I quote, a nonprofit corporation that operates 3 federally funded research and development centers, or FFRDCs. These FFRDCs provide objective analyses of national security issues, particularly those requiring scientific and technical expertise, and they conduct related research on other national challenges. In 2002 and 2003, I developed a survey of cyber attack attribution technologies on the behalf of the Department of Defense, DoD. This survey has been provided to the subcommittee and is also available to the public from the Defense Technical Information Center as IDA paper P-3792, Techniques on Cyber Attribution. Attribution in this context is determining the identity or location of an attacker or an attacker's intermediary. Since writing that paper, I've worked on improving the security and assurance of systems, lowering supply chain risks, improving open standards, and eliminating barriers to the use and development of open source software. It's good that this subcommittee is examining the relationship between attribution, privacy, and anonymity. As I noted in my paper, we should be concerned if attribution technologies developed in democracies are acquired and redeployed by governments with abusive human rights records to suppress freedom of speech and democracy movements. Apart from any concern of abuse by foreign governments, the use of these techniques by our government requires consideration of the Fourth Amendment's guarantee that people must be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. Section 3.13 of my paper specifically discusses the need to protect privacy and freedom of speech. With that as context, I'll address the overarching questions in this hearing's charter. The first question asked about the role of attack attribution in deterring cyber attacks. It noted that deterrence is a productive way to prevent physical attacks. In a similar way, cyber attack attribution can play an important role in deterring cyber attacks by enabling many deterrence measures. While there's great need to harden U.S. infrastructure from cyber attacks, passive computer network defenses cannot be and never will be perfect. This means that in some cases we may need to be able to respond to an attack. Unfortunately, many other countermeasures such as computer network counterattack, legal action, and kinetic energy counterattack can only be deployed if the source of the attack can be attributed with high confidence. The second question asks what roles the government and private industry should play. As of 2003, there was little evidence that the commercial sector was willing to shoulder the costs to develop attribution capabilities. Most commercial companies appeared to view identifying attackers as a law enforcement or military task, not a commercial one. If the government wants the ability to attribute attacks, in many cases the government may need to pay for it directly. One approach is to fund development and deployment of these abilities for widely used applications, both proprietary and open source software, And more than one product in each category should be funded so that the government's not locked into a single supplier. The third question asks for the distinguishing factors between anonymity and privacy, and how to account for both in the development and use of attribution technologies. As I noted in my paper, if the U.S. is to develop attribution technology, it should encourage the development or implementation of those attribution technologies that pose less danger to privacy. For example, logging systems could store message hashes, also known as message fingerprints, instead of the messages themselves. Since the data isn't stored, hashing only supports attribution of data the requester has already seen. A key part of implementing attribution technologies with fewer risks to privacy and anonymity is to ensure that any standards development related to attribution should include efforts to address these privacy and anonymity concerns. This brings me to the issue of standards, the focus of the fourth question. Standards are critically necessary for some attribution technologies, and the standards development process should work to address these privacy and anonymity concerns through public development and review. Such standards should be open standards to permit competition. In particular, should be publicly defined and held and shouldn't be patent encumbered. This suggests that the U.S. government should be involved in the development of such standards to ensure that its needs and concerns are met, just as the government's already involved in the development of other standards where there are specific government needs and concerns. I'll be happy to address your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wheeler. Mr. Knake, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Wu, and distinguished members of the House Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation for the opportunity to discuss the role of attack attribution in preventing cyber attacks. My name is Rob Knake. I'm an International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where I've spent the last year studying state conflict in cyberspace. So I will focus my comments on the attribution problem at that level first. It's my view that the problem of attribution has been largely overstated. For the high-end threats that my work is focused on, attribution will almost certainly be possible due to the limited number of actors that possess the capability to present a national security challenge in cyberspace. While we have all heard tales of teenagers with laptops sending viruses across the internet, these sorts of threats do not amount to a national security concern and cannot cause the type of havoc that many envision a cyber attack can. Estimates vary, but analysts who have studied the capabilities of both foreign governments and private groups have concluded that no more than 100 groups, and as possibly as few as 4 foreign militaries, possess the capability to cause real-world harm through cyber attacks. Moreover, such an attack would take significant investments of both time and money and teams of highly skilled specialists. While technical attribution may only provide limited evidence of who was behind the attack, traditional intelligence and law enforcement investigation can make up the difference. I have no doubt that in the event of a so-called Cyber Pearl Harbor, Cyber 9/11, or Cyber Katrina, that we will be able to amass enough evidence for the President to take action. For lower-level threats, everything from nuisance behavior like spam to cyber criminal activity, many in the cybersecurity community have viewed the development of ironclad attribution in real time as the holy grail. In one widely discussed scenario, all packets could be labeled with a unique identifier that would tie it to an individual, a so-called license plate for the Internet. It is my view that such a concept would be far more useful for authoritarian regimes to monitor and control Internet use by their citizens than it would be in combating cyber warfare, crime, and nuisance behavior. Criminals would find ways around this tracking mechanism, while average users would experience a near total loss of privacy. Moreover, such attribution would in no way force non-cooperative regimes to cooperate in investigating cybercrimes. As the title of my written testimony suggests, instead of focusing on attribution, we need to move to accountability in cyberspace. Non-cooperation in investigating international cyber attacks should be taken as a sign of culpability. States must be held responsible for securing their national cyberspace and should have an obligation to assist when their citizens or systems within their country are involved in a cyber attack. Chinese government officials will often protest and the blame their country receives in the Western press for cyber espionage against both government and corporate targets by suggesting that the systems the attacks are traced to are simply compromised proxies that have been used to mask the identity of the real attackers. They will also suggest that systems in their country are used disproportionately in these attacks because of the poor state of cybersecurity due to the widespread use of pirated software and low installation rates for even the most basic software security. This scenario may very well be plausible, but even if true, I would argue that it is no longer an acceptable excuse. We need to move to a situation in which countries not only assist in investigating, but also have mechanisms in place to shut down systems that are controlling attacks or participating in botnets. Failure to assist should be treated as complicity. Let me conclude with a comment on the issue of deterrence. Much ink has been spilled trying to make the Cold War construct of deterrence applicable in cyberspace, but I believe the results of these efforts are unpersuasive. Deterrence during the Cold War was predicated on mutually assured destruction. While better attribution can let us know who is attacking us, most potential adversaries do not have as heavy reliance on network technologies in their industries, governments, or militaries. Thus, in order to retaliate in any significant way, we would be forced to escalate out of the cyber domain and conduct kinetic attacks. That is not a situation we want to be in, and the threat to do so may be perceived as incredible, thus limiting its deterrent factor. Instead, we need to focus on improving our defenses and make the investments to secure our portion of cyberspace. Thank you very much.
Yes, good morning. My name is Ed Giorgio. I'm the president of Ponte Technologies. Let me begin by commending Chairman Wu and committee members for looking into this important matter. Having personally spent a career in science and technology, and having witnessed numerous R&D innovations that improve the quality of our lives, economic livelihoods, security, and privacy, I'm confident that this committee will undertake the proper initiatives to solve long-term and extremely difficult problems such as the one we face with cyber attack attribution. Post-attack attribution today is not effective, and the protocols we have today are insufficient to provide it. The recent attacks on Google are neither new or surprising. What is new is the extensive publicity they generated. But despite all this publicity, and a convincing case that they were perpetrated by a state-sponsored actor in China, the rate of such cyber attacks coming from China has not decreased. Current attribution capabilities are clearly no deterrent. We envision transitioning to a multi-protocol Internet infrastructure where services offered over DoD network segments and sensitive commercial and financial networks would require transmission using new protocols that have accountability and attribution built into their design. On such networks, attack attribution would meet the requirements for legal evidence without giving away sensitive sources and methods. Other less sensitive services might be offered over network segments, such as Radio Free America, which allow or indeed welcome interaction with anonymous entities. This is another case where the current protocols are lacking. They have little support for anonymity or for real flexibility in how much personal information is revealed in a transaction. Each citizen should have access to a certificate or other token that uniquely identifies the holder, along with others that provide less or even no identity information. It should be possible to acquire as many such identity certificates as are needed to support multiple online roles. Some organizations already provide physical analogs in the form of prepaid credit cards or anonymous pay-as-you-go cell phones. As Americans, we fiercely defend our right to privacy and security and subsequently create a vision where we achieve both simultaneously. But transparency is also important. Indeed, one might argue that the history of human social development and even evolution was driven by transparency of action. But we have witnessed 3 transformations brought about by technology that are having profound impact on human behavior. From attributable to anonymous, from discoverable to forever hidden, and from understandable to magical. Wherever we lost transparency, whether into governments, corporations, or individuals, bad actors eventually emerged and violated our trust and our laws. The threat comes from all these actors, many of whom are beyond the reach of our American courts, whether it is the Chinese stealing our American innovations to produce less expensive versions, the Russians engaging in financial crimes, the Israelis stealing our political intentions, the French stealing our competition-sensitive materials, the Nigerians conning our elderly, and so on. Closer to home, we face the same threats from within our borders. In the past, gross violations of domestic civil liberties were justified by reference to foreign threat. These are very dangerous constitutional grounds we tread, and the gravity of the legal and constitutional dimensions cannot be trivialized. So in conclusion, my comments are not focused on promoting what the ideal balance between privacy and security should be, but rather a challenge to those embracing the utopian view that both may be simultaneously within our grasp. While we will continue to insist that private information remain just that, and that anonymous persona will be supported, the existence of a trusted third party may be the only way to ensure that. In my opinion, government has not yet earned the necessary trust to perform this role, and we will require a lot more transparency and oversight before giving that trust. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giorgio. Mr. Rotenberg, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm president of the Electronic Privacy Information Center, and I teach privacy law at Georgetown, and I've been involved in most of the debates about cybersecurity and privacy going back 25 years. My organization publishes an important report about privacy and human rights around the world, and I draw attention to this because in our testimony, we talk about the use of attribution by governments, not necessarily for the purpose of promoting cybersecurity, but actually to monitor and track people with unpopular political opinions. China has the most advanced means of attribution today for Internet users. They require Internet users to individually register themselves, to provide their true names, their email addresses, and the list of news services from which they receive information on the Internet. They require Internet service providers to keep detailed logs on the activities of people who get access to the Internet through Chinese licensed ISPs. And they require the cyber cafes, which is the main point of access for people in China who want to get information on the Internet, to track all the activity and keep these records for 60 days to make them available to the Chinese government. And most interestingly, because I also have a background in managing one of the Internet domains, the .org domain, when the .cn domain became available for website registration, the Chinese government also required that people, business people, who wanted to create an Internet website using the .cn domain provide their actual name and a photograph to the government so that they could also be identified. Now, China, of course, is not alone, and I cited in my testimony similar examples involving Burma, Syria, Iran, and Egypt. The point that I'm trying to make here is that there's a real risk, which I think was suggested by one of the other witnesses, that attribution techniques through this means of keeping track of what people do online will be used for purposes unrelated to cybersecurity that has a real impact on human rights and freedom of expression, because of course what attribution also does is make people think twice about saying things that might be unpopular or controversial. Now, fortunately, in the United States, as I also describe in my testimony, we have a very strong constitutional right to speak anonymously, which is perhaps not surprisingly because the Federalist Papers that provided the basis for our country were written by people who made frequent use of pseudonyms. They understood that publishing their views in a way that could be easily attributable to them might quell their efforts to change the form of government that existed in the colonies at the time. And our courts have said repeatedly that anonymity is an important right that is protected within the First Amendment. More recently, we've also been involved in the cases involving Internet freedom in the famous ACLU versus Reno case from 1996 that struck down the Communications Decency Act, where the Supreme Court affirmed the very important role that the First Amendment plays in protecting Internet freedom. Now, what I did in preparation for this hearing, with the help of our excellent law clerks who are at EPIC this summer, was to research the cases involving identification requirements for the Internet. We were trying to answer your very specific question. Would it be possible in the United States to have an identification requirement, a mandatory requirement for anyone who goes online, which is certainly being talked about? And our conclusion is that we don't think it would be possible. In the one case where an identification requirement has been upheld, and this was in the state of Utah after an earlier effort had been struck down, it was permitted only for convicted sex offenders where there was narrow collection of personal data and used for very narrow purposes. That is the only case that we could find. Finally, as I also set out in our testimony, looking at this problem of attribution turns out to be very difficult, as other witnesses have pointed out, primarily because it's so easy for people online to evade detection. Bruce Schneier, who's a noted security expert, said bluntly it's futile. What it will do will actually create new opportunities for people to hide because they will create new false credentials. And the recent report from the National Research Council that also looks at the issue of attribution reaches a similar conclusion. This is not to say that we aren't aware that there are serious network threats which obviously implicate privacy and security interests, but we think it's very important in this area to also consider the harmful impact that a broad attribution requirement might have for the freedom of Internet users. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Rotenberg. Now it's in order for questions, and first I want to note that we in Congress sit on multiple committees, and as is frequently the case, when there are two flies flying in the Grand Canyon, they collide. And I have votes occurring right now in my other committee, and I will have to excuse myself after asking this first set of questions, and I aspire to come back because this is a very, very important topic that I care about very much. Secondly, I would like to welcome our friends from Russia TV Today. I understand that Russia TV Today has also broadcast one of our NASA hearings. It's not unusual for foreign media to take a stronger interest in topics of importance to the United States, more so than American media does at times. And we welcome our Russian friends. But we also want to note that the usual process is to accredit into the committee prior to attendance, but you're welcome to stay today. Now, I think that each of the witnesses referred to, both in your spoken and oral testimony, that there may be some limited role for deterrence, and that there may be some greater role for attribution in protecting legitimate interests on the Internet, but that both deterrence and attribution to different extents are overplayed in the current discussion. I'd like each of the witnesses, to the extent you can or want to address first that opening inquiry about deterrence and attribution.
Well, I'll jump right in, and I'm sure the other witnesses will make comments. I cited in my testimony the conclusion of the National Research Council report because I thought this was a very thoughtful point they were making, particularly with non-state actors. They said attribution would be difficult. We're talking about entities that are typically outside of the United States, so you would need an attribution technology that's global. Not easy to identify outside the U.S., not much of a technical infrastructure, which means that there's not much opportunity to respond. And with some of the non-state actors, it's not even clear they wouldn't mind being identified. It's almost the exact inverse of the model that we had during the Cold War in our relationship with the Soviet Union. And I think the National Research Council report makes this point very well.
Yeah, I would. Excuse me. Yes, I would like to add, even in the hearing background that was put together by the staff, we talk about attribution not only from a point of view of identifying the person who is on the other side, but perhaps just identifying at least the location they're coming from. So if you have a purist view of attribution, I certainly agree that it is extremely difficult technologically to guarantee you know who the human person is on the other end. But that doesn't mean that some attack attribution technology wouldn't give us lots of information which could be used for other purposes, such as shutting down the computer at the other end, independent who is on it. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may speak as well. As I noted earlier, excuse me, there's no possibility of having absolutely perfect defenses. So there is, I believe there is value for attribution. On the other hand, we have to admit that attribution itself, as commented earlier, is difficult, and there are some serious limitations to that as well. Attackers can cause attacks to be delayed and perform their attacks through lots of intermediaries, and often can make it very difficult to attribute when they don't want to be attributed. And so basically, I think computer network defense shouldn't depend on attribution. It should be part of a larger strategy with having basically multiple tools in the toolbox.
The only comments I would add is that for the last decade, our strategy for preventing another major terrorist attack on U.S. soil has both been effective and does not in any way materially rely on deterrence. So I think that that may be a better model for how we deal with the cyber threat, to focus on prevention, to focus on protection, to focus on resiliency, rather than to focus on trying to deter cyber actors. The only other point I would make is that in a lot of cases, we don't lack attribution, we lack response options. We don't know what we should do when we discover that the Chinese have hacked into Google and 30 other countries. We seem to have fairly good evidence that they did that. We've traced the attack back. We have then asked for an explanation, and we've not received it. I'm not sure how better attribution, one further layer down, would help resolve that problem. Similarly, with French intelligence or Russian criminals, Nigerian scammers, we know their national origins. We simply lack response options and a mechanism for cooperating and requiring cooperation internationally.
Thank you very much. Because there are votes going on, and not only votes from me and my other committee, but I'm told close votes, I'm going to ask one further question, and then I'm going to step out and aspire to return promptly after those votes. Thank you for your answer to the deterrence and attribution question and its utility. Following up on that, I think several of you, perhaps all of you, have noted that to the extent that there is a deterrent utility and that there is a capability for attribution, that there is also potentially, or there is, a drastic effect on speech and free flow of information. And I think, Mr. Giorgio, you stated that in your written testimony that there's a necessary trade-off. And I don't know if others put it quite that crisply, but can you address that issue of, to the extent that we put attributability capability into the backbone of the Internet, that we would be decreasing anonymity, freedom of speech, and freedom of inquiry? Whoever wants to start with that.
Chairman, since you referenced me, let me also say that I do believe that we need protocols with a lot more privacy in them. And I'm very troubled by the situation today because, frankly, a lot of people learn information about us that they shouldn't need to know in, for example, a financial transaction. So it is very important that we build new protocols to protect anonymity, or privacy, I should say, when it's called for. So.
Right. I should say also, Mr. Chairman, that many businesses that operate on the Internet have identification requirements. In fact, there's a big controversy right now involving the company Blizzard, which offers World of Warcraft, and they are now requiring the use of true names for people who comment in the forums, and it's provoked a big discussion about identity requirements as a way to make people a little bit more hospitable online. But the key point here is that whatever decisions private companies might make about identification is really very different from a government-mandated identification requirement. Because what a government-mandated identification requirement does is basically hold out the specter that if you say something that is unpopular and the government can trace it back to you, the government can hold you accountable. And I think that's really anathema to our view in the U.S. of freedom of expression. And so it concerns us, of course, that a government-mandated identification requirement, wherever it may be imposed in the world, could have a similar impact on political speech.
I think I would echo those comments, but I would also add that I see the equation in need of being reversed. I actually think government needs to do a better job of protecting the privacy of users in the commercial arena. That is where the biggest threat to privacy is today. The reliance on anonymity, which is still very, very useful for protecting freedom of speech and is useful for protecting freedom to access information, is not useful in the context of communicating, banking, and interacting the way we do online. And increasingly, commercial web operators are tracking their users without telling them by downloading cookies onto their computers, some very insidious forms, and using other geolocation technologies that your browser, your computer, your internet service provider, and the services that you're using online are all by default not going to tell you that that is going on. So essentially, you surrendered your anonymity without knowing it. And in my view, government needs to step in to create some form of disclosure that is upfront and obvious to the average internet user that for the free content, they will be tracked and that will be used to target advertising at them.
If I may jump in also. So first of all, getting back a little bit to the original question, clearly attribution technologies have potential to greatly harm anonymity, pseudonymity, and privacy and so on, but it's not the same for all the different technologies. Some technologies are much riskier than others. I cited, probably the more egregious example, recording every bit that goes back and forth between a user and everything else. Has radically different effects than storing much smaller pieces of information, fingerprints and so on. So there's, depending on what is stored and how it's stored, makes a big difference on the effect on anonymity and privacy and pseudonymity.
May I make an addition?
Giorgio.
Yes, thank you. I think credibility is very important when we decide who to listen to. So whether it's the distinguished members of this committee or my distinguished colleagues, when they speak, I want to listen because I know I know what they've gone through to get to the position they're in today. So all of that is lost when people speak with anonymity, and so I would. And even during emergencies, it would be very important to me, for example, if somebody who is reporting from ground zero, if I have some confidence that they are actually at ground zero. So the credibility of listening to what people have to say is tied up to some extent in being able to attribute who they are, what their past is, how they came to be in that position, and why we should listen to them, and where they are. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I am going to hand over the gavel to the gentlelady from Maryland, Ms. Edwards. And also, before I do that, I will recognize Mr. Smith for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I'd also like to briefly note that it's my understanding a follow-up hearing in which we hear from NIST, the National Science Foundation, and other relevant federal agencies is under consideration, and I would certainly like to offer my support for holding such a hearing. Regarding the questions that I have, I was wondering if you could just share what you think are the best methods for tracing the attacks. Anyone, maybe start with Dr. Wheeler?
That's actually turns out to be more difficult than you. I would like to give you a very simple, there it is, there is the one solution. And of course, life is often more complicated than we wish it could be. Actually, what's intriguing that when I started writing this particular paper that I mentioned earlier and I submitted as testimony, I didn't expect there to be many different possible ways to do this, and it turned out, in fact, there are a very large number. And although I haven't worked on this particular area more recently, the number can only go up. So there turns out to be a remarkably large number of ways. And unfortunately, what it really turns out to be is, I suspect people aren't surprised when you deal with technologies, there are various trade-offs. Some of the techniques are particularly helpful for tracking down what's called denial of service attacks. You're being attacked, sent a lot of messages, maybe from many different places, and there's basically constant streaming of data. In that case, the very fact that someone is constantly sending messages to you and trying to overwhelm your systems means that you can try to track back, well, I just wait for the next one and start looking backwards that way, for example. Other techniques, but of course, those techniques that depend on that don't work for many kinds of attacks where, in fact, that isn't what happens. It's a few messages and all of a sudden your systems are down or something terrible has happened. So I don't believe there is a single answer. There is a set. And one other good thing about that, from the point of view of this particular hearing, is that some of them are much more egregious or concerning in terms of privacy and attribution. Probably one of the more extreme examples, I guess, would be the what's I guess informally called hackbacks, where you actually, I'm being attacked, I'm breaking into backwards, the computers backwards to find out where that comes from. Unsurprisingly, that is severely restricted by U.S. laws, and it should be, as well it should be. But sometimes, particularly if those systems are under control of outside powers, and it's really critically important, that may be, and nothing's been prepositioned, that may be one of the few techniques available. I will quickly note, though, that a number of these techniques fundamentally require prepositioning. You can't say, you can't wake up in the morning and say, I'd like to know where this attack came from. Many of these techniques require systems to be already in place before you can do the attribution. And I think that's one of the reasons why discussions and hearings like this are necessary, because if you want it, if we, the United States, wish this kind of capability, we're going to need to put things in place, and thus that requires this kind of discussion that we're having today.
Yeah, thank you. Well, since I have limited time, I also want to note, Mr. Rotenberg, in your testimony, you said that no matter how good attribution technologies are, that it will probably still fail to identify the most sophisticated attackers. So I guess I have to ask the question, if, are our efforts futile, and if other attribution technologies will not be able to get the job done, what are the other options for protecting us from cyber attacks?
Yeah, Congressman, thank you for the question. I don't think they're futile, and I think it is important, particularly for us to improve our security through education and open standards. I think it's important to develop better forensic techniques so it's possible to trace back attacks, as Dr. Wheeler described. I'll also mention, one of the key problems here, which was uncovered in a workshop shortly after 9/11 that I participated in, where people were talking about attribution. Admiral Poindexter brought us together and said, well, how do we solve this problem? And someone said, well, you could, hash a person's unique DNA against every keystroke, so that everything that went from your keyboard, every single stroke, was uniquely defined to, tied to a biometric identifier. And people said, wow, we've solved the attribution problem. Isn't that great? And someone said, well, what if you have a guy standing next to the user with a gun telling someone who's authorized what to type into the keyboard? Now what do you do? In other words, you can have perfect attribution in a hostage situation, and by the way, probably a good plot for a movie, and still not be able to prevent a smart attacker, which I think reveals really how difficult this challenge is. I'm not saying that we shouldn't improve security or pursue good forensic techniques. I just think it would be a mistake for practical reasons, in addition to human rights reasons, to place too much emphasis on attribution.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses today. I just have a basic question. It's kind of as a consumer. All of these questions revolve around balancing the need for security, balanced against the protection of privacy. And so, where do you strike that balance? Mr. Rotenberg, I wonder if you could tell me, almost every website on the internet uses cookies to collect data over activity. As a consumer, I know I get to make a decision. Do I really want to type in all of that personal information that they ask me, or go through the list of things until I find out that I actually don't have to give them that information at all, unless if I check the box way down at the bottom after scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And then you get free services in exchange for turning over all of your information. And so there are instances, for example, where the user wants to do that, and so they make a decision to do it. There are other instances where, for some reason, to get something sent to your home, the commercial enterprise has to have it. Otherwise, they can't mail what it is that you want. And so, how is it that the need to protect the user privacy, being as important as it is, can the federal government help me, the average internet user, understand what my options are and what the consequences are for sharing that information, for sharing it at that moment, but also the longer-term consequences once that information is housed someplace or other or shared with some other source?
Well, Congresswoman, thank you for the excellent question. While on the national security side, I imagine there's a sense that there's not enough attribution. I can tell you on the consumer side, there's a sense that there's way too much attribution, which is to say that when someone does a Google search, you simply type in, apartments, Virginia, because you're interested in trying to find an apartment in Virginia. I'll bet no one has any understanding, or very few people do, that at that moment in time, Google will record the time and the date when the search was made, the search query, the cookie tied to the user ID. If they have a unique identity, the IP address for the device, that will also be recorded. All of this information will be collected and stored by the company for every single search and kept for months, maybe years, building this enormous profile. And from the privacy perspective, we think that's very invasive. It even creates some security risks if the information is misused. In fact, part of the great concern about network vulnerability, Google's experience in China, was that they essentially lost control over a lot of sensitive information because of internal vulnerabilities that were exploited. That information that they lost control of included a lot of personal data on Google users. So we think on this side, the government actually has a role in protecting consumer privacy by limiting the amount of data that's being collected and giving people more control over that data.
Thank you. And then, Mr. Giorgio, you mentioned in your testimony that the bulk of the privacy concern is actually directed at our own government. I was reading, I think just in the last day or so, about the National Security Agency program, Perfect Citizen. And while there's sort of this need, obviously, to safeguard our infrastructure, whether it's our nuclear plants, the power grid, et cetera, there's concern that using a tool like that could then really impede on all of our individual privacy, giving up that anonymity that you've described is a constitutional protection. But we have to rely on the government to really protect us from all the bad actors. So I wonder if you could discuss the difficulties in achieving both security and privacy, especially when the bad guy of one concept is the protector of the other, and in an environment where the if the bad guys are operating in concert, that's kind of one thing. But we have a whole bunch of just bad actors, whether they're from Nigeria trying to get my mother's money or from someplace else. And those set of actors are completely, they may be uncoordinated, they may be individuals, and to draw a national security concern around trying to protect against those kind of actors is, I think, a little complicated.
Yes. Thank you, Congresswoman. I couldn't sort of agree more. When Mr. Rotenberg just made his point. I agree with him that we may fear government least of all. It's these companies who have all these databases that are a true threat to us. So, and if we look at what's happening in many of these databases that are being collected, for example, all the databases that bind our physical location to our use of wireless devices, such as cell phones, these are all in the hands of the private sector. And it's quite easy, and in this country they're in the hands of the private sector. I wouldn't go overseas and wander about with a cell phone turned on, you know, if I wanted to protect my anonymity or privacy, and so I see it over and over again that there's a myriad of bad actors out there, the least of which may be government. And as you point out, government does have a role to protect our critical infrastructure, but I'm not sure they're the greatest threat to our privacy.
Mr. Rohrbacher, I think you're up.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I was just, that last point was made, it's very interesting. If you are in a relatively free society, that may be true. In a relatively dictatorial society, the opposite is true. And the idea of how what you demand of people who are involved themselves in this arena of affairs in a society, it's a very complicated issue. And it's, for example, where I happen to believe in the maximum degree of individual freedom. I can also understand that in France, for example, they don't want to say women shouldn't wear a burqa. All right, but there's some national security implications to that rather than just cultural implications as well. We don't permit people to go around hiding their identity as they're walking around the street, or do we? Do we in this society?
Well, it's a very interesting point, Congressman. Actually, the United States, unlike most other countries, does not allow its police to ask people on the street to present identity documents.
Right.
There actually has to be some suspicious activity that provides a reason for the police to be able to say to someone, may I see, some identification. That's not true in most countries.
Right.
In many countries, you can be asked without suspicion to identify yourself.
I'm wondering if a person wearing a mask would be suspicious activity.
Yes, it is, and we
ask them enough to.
We actually do have anti-mask laws in many states in the U.S.
Right.
So that's generally not permitted. But as for your identification, that's something that we tend to allow people to keep to themselves.
This is, of course, what we're talking about, cyber attacks. It's very similar to the idea that challenge faced by the entertainment industry of people who are unlawfully making copies and downloads of material. I guess that's sort of a cyber attack. Is there technology that any of you know about that you believe that is this a technological solution rather than a government regulatory solution?
So there are problems that require authentication and authorization, knowing who people are and what they have access to do. And there's a tremendous amount of very good security research and, in fact, solutions today that provide these strong access controls. Digital rights management, which protects which protects music, is one form of those controls. The goals of those controls is not dissimilar to the DoD goals of trying to protect information. So as technology gets developed in various places, it's frequently leveraged for other purposes.
Is the technology solution a wall, or is it a retaliatory strike, you might say, against someone who's come into your system?
Well, in the copyright arena, it's actually a tracking technique. As Mr. Giorgio mentioned, digital rights management is much like a watermark, and it basically allows an entity both to assign its ownership of a product, of a digital product, and also identify who the appropriate user is. So if it's in the possession of someone who didn't properly acquire the song or the movie, they will essentially be tracked down through that digital watermark.
Is it possible in dealing with hackers and dealing with these type of cyber attacks to have a situation if someone doesn't have an authorization to be where they are electronically, that there is an instant retaliation against their own equipment, meaning a disintegration of the system that's the vehicle for this aggression?
So that capability is possible. Whether whether it's not is actually done anywhere, I don't know.
Is that something that we should strive for?
This is David Wheeler. Is it possible? I agree with him. Yes. Should we do it? I would be extremely hesitant. As I noted in my paper, attribution is something that, although it can be done, there's always the risk of misattribution. And indeed, for some attackers, that may be actually their primary goal, is to try to accomplish misattribution, perform an attack and cause misattribution of the attack.
Oh, I see.
And so therefore, that doesn't mean under no possible circumstance could we never imagine this, but I would be very hesitant about installing such a automatic counterattack system. Generally, for most kinds of, certainly for military systems, you want a human in the loop, double checking first.
Well, just one note, and I know my time is up after this, that, and I don't know how to pronounce it, is can't, say it again? Okay, I'm having time. I have surfers here in this ear, and I have trouble.
I'm sorry, it's Kanaki.
Kanaki. You mentioned that efforts made after 9/11 actually identifying methodology has actually had a major impact in preventing another 9/11. I would suggest it's not just identification, however. It's identification and retaliation. If we just had identified potential al-Qaeda terrorists since then and let them be, we would have had another 9/11. We aggressively sought them out and in some cases killed them, which was good, or send them to Guantanamo, which is debatable. But there was actually an action taken. So the identification isn't the only step that needs to happen if we are to protect ourselves from that type of, the electronic type of aggression. You can answer that if you'd like, that's fine.
Thank you, sir. I think that's absolutely right, and I think I would go a step further. Prior to 9/11, the U.S. roving ambassador for counterterrorism, Michael Sheehan, delivered a very stern message to the Taliban, which was essentially, if we are attacked by al-Qaeda, who planned their attack on your soil, we will hold you responsible for that. The Taliban did not get that message until after 9/11, but we followed through on that. So essentially, we assigned responsibility to the Taliban for the activities carried out by a terrorist organization on their soil. Their failure after 9/11 to cooperate with apprehending bin Laden resulted in the invasion of their country. So I think it's actually very analogous to the situation we want to move to in cyberspace, where if a country refuses to cooperate in an investigation that attributes the attack to a system or an individual in their country, we in turn hold them responsible for it.
Thank you very much. That was very astute, and I appreciate you permitting me, Madam Chairman, the right of giving a question because I'm not a member of this subcommittee. But thank you for allowing me to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher. I have just one question. We're going to take one question. We've been called for votes. The chairman will come back, and so we're actually going to recess. He is on his way back, and so I'm just going to stall and ask my question. Mr. Giorgio, it's actually an important question. You discussed the need for standards in a lot of areas, and you say that government should actually invest in this development, but allow standards development organizations like Internet Engineering Task Force to develop them through normal processes. But Mr. Knake has testified to the difficulties involved in using these processes to produce standards, specifically new protocols, and advocates for more government involvement. How can the federal government better protect the development of consensus-based standards?
So Mr. Kanaki is quite accurate on that point. It is extremely difficult to get these standards pushed through the standards bodies, even when various governments are behind them. So I think, but first and foremost, we have to develop the technology that will allow us to propose those standards in the first place. In parallel, we have to work with the standards committees, however difficult that is, and try and influence the course of those standards.
Mr. Knake, I mean, there are just so many different agencies, though, whether you're talking about the DOD, the FBI, I mean, just all of these various agencies that all use so many different tools. I mean, it does feel very daunting to then create a standard for the multiple tools that are used within these agencies. Do you have any comment about that?
I certainly would recognize the problem that you're highlighting. I think in a couple areas, however, it is a narrower issue, particularly for the main suite of Internet protocols, which are universal. And I think we have a fairly good set of what are the security problems with those protocols and how they should be addressed. Essentially, how do we secure them to a standard to which they cannot be abused, but not to a standard in which attribution becomes ironclad across the Internet. And so that's the area where I think we need to return to a situation of more government intervention. These protocols were initially developed for the Defense Department with U.S. government funding. I think a similar initiative now would be in order in an effort to address the vulnerabilities that were introduced in that original protocol suite.
Thank you very much. And I see the chairman has returned, and so I'll let him take it from here. And thank you very much.
We have about 7 minutes before floor votes. And I frequently talk about having 3 rings going in this particular circus at any given time, at least when we're here in Washington. And that's why it takes more time when we're home in our districts, because we can only do one thing at a time there. I have several more questions. If the minority does not, I will try to get my questions in before we go vote on the floor. But let's see how we do. Based on both your spoken, but particularly your written testimony, I get the impression that you all are of the opinion that there's limited utility for any particular security technique, and that some combination of techniques would afford us potentially the best combination of security and privacy. Is that roughly accurate?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. If that is the case, is it further sort of what you overtly state or what you imply that perhaps we have a system of networks in our country or in the world which are best served by different degrees of security and privacy/anonymity? That is, we might set a different standard for those networks dealing with publicly available information or journalism or blogs and opinions. We might set a higher standard for networks dealing with utilities, the power grid, or banking or financial transactions, and we might set, again, an even higher standard for, let's say, DoD or NSA types of networks. Can you address that?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think there are a couple different ways to think about it. Certainly, we have within the United States and in the military community, for example, secure networks that are essentially not connected to the public open Internet. But with respect to the public open Internet, I think as much as possible, we want to keep systems connected because of all the benefits that the Internet provides, and place the added security obligations at the endpoints. In other words, if there are applications or organizations or entities that have needs for enhanced security, for example, password and user ID is a simple one, place the responsibility there, and as much as possible maintain the common protocols of the public Internet for general use. Now, that's not to say, as I said at the outset, that clearly there will be segregated networks for specialized purposes. But I am concerned, as Vince Cerf and others have expressed concern about the possible balkanization of the Internet. If we start carving things up too much, literally separating parts of the network out from other parts, we'll lose a lot of the benefit.
Sir, I'm on DARPA Oversight Board with Vince Cerf on an issue related to this. And I completely agree with Mr. Rotenberg that, we have to preserve as much as possible for common use, okay? However, when somebody is providing a service at one end of the network and somebody is somewhere else in the world trying to use that service, it is the responsibility of that endpoint to enforce the protocol that they will demand that person to use. So they might be on the same backbone, but we might have very different protocols running through that and effectively have different networks. But we don't want to physically separate them, and I think Marc said the same thing.
If I can jump in here also. I very much, by the way, agree that there are different levels of anonymity, privacy, desires comparing, say, the public Internet versus, say, a network inside the DoD that involves classified information or weapon systems or something. You would expect a whole lot less anonymity in the latter situation. I think the interesting thing is that I guess there's somewhat odd good news that attribution often tends to be a lot easier against insiders. Most of the we were talking about this before while you were out, Congressman Wu, but many of these attribution technologies fundamentally require pre-positioning. You've got to put the technology in place ahead of time. That tends to be easier to do inside a smaller closed network. The DoD is of course large, but nevertheless it's certainly not as large as, say, the United States as a whole or some such. And therefore, when you have a smaller network, you can treat it as inside an organization. It is much easier to pre-position things. And so in that sense, at least, you can put attribution technologies available that perhaps at least will tell you, well, he's inside and there he is, or he's outside, and now at least maybe I should start closing off the gates for them to come inside.
Some of you have addressed the need for standards for the operation of anonymity services like Hotspot Shield. And I think the argument is that because these services make it easier for folks to do all sorts of things anonymously, that there is an interest in different forms of access or identifiers in order to gain this level of anonymity. And there may be a difference of opinion on this issue, and I'd like to have that specifically addressed.
Well, let me say that, pure anonymity means that you really can't trace back to the user. Now, there are a lot of escrow-style configurations where you can allow people to conceal their public identity but still put a responsibility on a service provider to say, for example, with a warrant, we now need to know who this person is. And this isn't true anonymity, but it gives, many of the elements of anonymity. Here's the hard problem. True anonymity, which we think is important, will protect the political dissident in a country that's hostile to the person's views and may, in fact, imprison the person if his identity is known. Pure anonymity will also protect the pedophile who's trying to distribute images on the Internet and should be prosecuted and imprisoned. And you see in this one tool, there's one application that we would value very much and another application that we would try to prevent. And if we go the half step in and we say, well, maybe we should allow this through a pseudonym escrow service, it will be easier to catch the person engaging in the transfer of child pornography. It would also be easier to catch the human rights advocate. It's not a simple problem.
Well, that's what I was thinking about in reading the testimony. That one of the suggestions is to, one of the, if you will, trap doors is if you get a legitimate judicial decree asking for identification in connection with a crime, well, we in our society would view pedophilia as very legitimate for such a judicial decree, and it is my impression that there are other countries where for what we view as vague crimes like breach of state security, which can cover a whole host of activities that in this country we view as legitimate, that may result in the issuance of a valid judicial decree. And the question is, how does the third party respond to such a judicial decree, which on its face, these two decrees are indistinguishable.
That's the dilemma.
Yeah, I think I think we need to rely on other types of third parties in these circumstances. It might be perfectly okay for me to positively identify myself to my identity provider, but then perhaps that identity provider could enable me to talk to a search agent, for example, and maintain my privacy. The identity provider might be blind to everything I do, and the service doing the searching for me doesn't know who I am, but yet because that privacy is provided to me by a third party.
I would only add that if what you're looking for is anonymity, there's a limited number of reasons that you really need that. It's freedom of speech, it's access to information. So restricting the ability to use these services for transactions can cut down on a lot of criminal behavior and a lot of network infiltration.
If there is no further answer on this question, the rules of this committee preclude us from recessing and reconvening without a minority member present, and since that apparently is not possible, I'm going to adjourn this meeting momentarily. I do want to point out, there are many additional questions, many additional topics to be covered. You all have prepared very thorough presentations, and it is normally the practice of this subcommittee, in addition to asking many questions, to ask you all to also, to give you all an opportunity to say anything in addition that has not been asked. We apparently will not have that opportunity today. There will be written inquiry of each of you. In particular, I'm curious as to the confidence that the legal analyses that some of you all have presented, that your level of confidence, since these are district court opinions. And I also want to commend the law clerks
for having done a fine job. I just want to add that I think there is enough material here for an interesting law review note, or maybe several law review notes. And also, in particular, I'd like to have addressed the role of international agreements, international standards, and agreements about what constitutes a breach, what constitutes an attack, and what kind of standards there should be for the various technologies for attribution or otherwise. And finally, I think that addressing the issue of standards in general, it needs to be further fleshed out. I want to thank you all for your presence, for your tolerance, for the wrinkles in congressional operation. And as I said to some of you before the hearing began, you prepared very, very thoughtful, thought-provoking, and dense materials. It's as if I were trying to reduce to 5 or 10 pages how Congress really works, the version that is not in your high school civic textbooks. It would require a lot of parsing of what's between the lines. I want to thank you all very much for being here today. This subcommittee hearing is adjourned.